So good morning, everyone. Welcome to this part of our day, part where I get to say something to you for a little while. So this morning I'm going to be in a sort of roundabout way talking about the Sangha. This whole series that we've been doing over recent weeks has been around the Sangha, aspects of the Sangha. And yeah, today I was going to talk on what is the Sangha, or at least that's the title I gave to what I have to say. But then I thought, well, that's really what the whole series has been about. What is the Sangha? So I thought I'd be a little bit more specific. And this morning's talk is now called, as you can see from the little slide we have here, the true individual. And what's the relationship between that true individual and the Sangha? So thanks, Silanatha. Move on from that one. So we can speak of the Sangha in several different ways. We can speak of the Mahasangha, the greater Sangha, if you like, which is the Sangha, perhaps we should say, of everyone who would include themselves under the Buddhist umbrella. So people who are born into a Buddhist country would probably regard themselves as Buddhists, irrespective of what practice they may or may not do. People who just come along to the Buddhist center out of interest, just to see what's going on, we might include under this greater Sangha umbrella figure. So Mahasangha is the Sangha at its widest, at its most general, if you like. Now within Triratna, we then have further specific categories of Sangha, you could say. We have the Mitra Sangha. So that's the Sangha of those who have decided that they want to commit themselves to following a Buddhist path. They've made a public declaration of that in a lovely ceremony that we call a Mitra ceremony, naturally enough. And these are people who are committed to trying to put Buddhist practice into effect in their life. As we go a bit deeper into that, as we feel a stronger and stronger commitment, we may ask for ordination. And we then join what is called the Sangha of Mitras who've asked for ordination, sometimes abbreviated to the GFR Mitra Sangha. And this is the Sangha of those people who are working towards going for refuge to the three jewels, the central defining point of their lives. It's going for refuge becomes what they build their life around more and more. And eventually, when that's seen to be effective, they join the order and become part of the order Sangha. Again, that's not a goal, that's not an end point. The order Sangha reflects another degree of commitment, if you like, another degree of building one's life even more fully around going for refuge and taking that deeper and deeper towards the realization, insight into the nature of reality and ultimately enlightenment. And that brings in the Arya Sangha, the Sangha of the noble ones. So traditionally, this is the Sangha to which one goes for refuge. This is the Sangha of all of those beings in whom some degree of transcendental insight into the true nature of reality has arisen, and as a consequence of which they are irreversibly heading towards enlightenment. So Sangha are a very, very high spiritual level, but not beyond the reach of each and every one of us, at least in its lower stages. So many, many different levels of Sangha, many different ways of using the term. So what is it that connects all these different levels or types of Sangha? Well, obviously they all share a connection with the Buddha and his teachings to varying degrees. And we look at that in some depth regularly in our classes, but this morning I'm not going to look so much at the Buddha's teachings, not directly anyway, But I'd like to explore a slightly different aspect of Sangha, or look at it from a different angle, shall we say. So in that spirit, I'm now going to tell you that there is no such thing as Sangha. So we ask the question, what is the Sangha? Well, I'm putting to you that there is no such thing as Sangha. That is, there's no such thing as Sangha as an entity in and of itself. We have this often unhelpful tendency to, when we attach a name or a label to something, to start thinking of it as having a real existence in its own right, as though it becomes a thing simply because we've attached a label to it, simply because we've said, right, there is Sangha. So therefore, somewhere out there in the ether exists this mystical thing called Sangha we're all part of, that we can join. But in fact, Sangha doesn't exist in that way at all, of course. Sangha simply is us. Sangha is the relationships, if you like, between the individuals that participate in it. And without those individuals in relationship to one another, there is no such thing as Sangha. It simply doesn't exist. So when we ask the question, what is the Sangha? We're really looking at, well, what are we? What are we? Because we are the Sangha. So if we want to answer the question, we need to be able to say what we are. So most of what I have to say today is drawn from my understanding and my experience of Sangharakshita's teachings on Sangha. I can see with us this morning, we've got some people from the Clacton Mitra study group, so they're going to be very familiar with this material because we've just finished doing it. That doesn't mean they can switch off, but they'll have an advantage over some of you when it comes to group discussions. Not that I'm trying to put them on the spot. So if Sangha is made up of individuals and the relationship between individuals, well, how do we define individuals then? What do we mean when we speak of individuals? Sangharakshita, in his book, The Three Jewels, in the section on the Sangha, goes to great lengths to define the individual. Several chapters of quite dense writing and explanation of what he means by an individual. And that's because Sangharakshita, of course, never used language carelessly. If Sangharakshita uses a specific word, he uses it for a specific meaning. It's not just a generalization. So when Bhante used the term individual, he's using it in a very precise, very particular way. And that really is what we're going to look at this morning. That's the heart of what I want us to try and get to this morning. What do we actually mean when we speak of an individual? Now, Bhante starts his section of the Three Jewels that deals with the individual with a question. And that question is, am I an individual or just a social unit? And it's a very pokey question because I think probably most of us, if not all of us, would react to some degree to being called a social unit. None of us wants to be a social unit. None of us wants to be a statistic. I'm reminded, those of you of a similar age to me may remember the TV series called The Prisoner back in the 70s. And the plaintive cry of the prisoner, I am not a number. And of course, that's our reaction for most of us when we think we're being treated as just a number, just a statistic. That no, I'm a real person, I'm an individual. But what do we actually mean by being an individual? So Sangharakshita has very clear views on what constitutes an individual, certainly in terms of Buddhist practice anyway. What makes us an individual? And he identifies a number of characteristics, a number of qualities that the individual would possess, would have. So if we could have the next slide, please. So here's a list of some of the qualities. It's not an exhaustive list by any means, but this perhaps brings out the major categories of what it means to be an individual. These are indicative of the main features of such a person, of you or me, to the extent that we are individual. I think it's important to point out, of course, that this isn't black and white. These are not either or options. It's not that you have these qualities or you don't have them. To varying degrees, we'll all have these qualities, some more developed than others. And part of our practice, part of the object of our practice, of course, is to continue to develop to ever higher levels these various qualities, to work on all these positive aspects of our being as we make that transition from a social unit to an individual, a true individual in Sangharakshita's terms. So these qualities would be, for example, objectivity, being able to see ourselves as we really are as best we can. Clarity, so clarity of thought, having a clear mind, having an understanding of where we are and of where we want to go, and a reasonably good idea of how to progress in that direction, so not being muddled. Intelligence. Now here Bhante is not talking about having a high IQ, of possessing all sorts of academic qualifications. Really, I think just having that ability to think for oneself, being able to think about something, being able to think about the consequences of our actions, being able to think about what we need to do, being able to think about the Dharma and how we could apply it to our lives. So intelligence in that sense. An awareness of our responsibility for our actions. So bringing into play the principle of karma here, understanding that our actions have consequences and we bear the responsibility for the effect of our actions in the world around us, in making sure that those actions are positive as far as we possibly can. So bringing in ethical practice, turning more and more towards skillful ethical behavior, hallmark of the individual, that striving for skillful ethical behavior. Being receptive, being open, not having a closed mind brings in some of those other qualities higher up on the list. Being prepared to listen, being prepared to accept that we don't know it all, and that there are others who just may be a bit more experienced and further along the spiritual path than we are, from whom we can benefit. Freedom from group conditioning, a very big one, this, of course. Yeah, all of our lives we're conditioned to follow the norms of the society in which we live, to be a good member of society, to be part of the group, not to step out of line. Now, some aspects of the group can be positive, but all too often the group is restrictive. It demands conformity at the expense of exclusion if we're not prepared to conform, and it doesn't embrace the idea of spiritual growth in the way that we might see it. And then we have awareness in various categories. So awareness of self, awareness of the world that we inhabit, awareness of others, and awareness of reality. So let's have a look at these in a bit more detail. So if we could go on to the next slide, please. So we have awareness of self as the first of these areas of awareness. And this we could sum up as being an objective awareness of ourselves, being able to see ourselves as we really are. Obviously, we'll have our blind spots, we all do, but to some extent, at least being able to see ourselves as we are, not to sort of live in the story that we tell ourselves, but being realistic about who we are and where we are. An awareness of our body at its most basic level, just an awareness of our physical presence, that here is this body, You know, we're sitting here this morning, you're sitting listening to me, I'm sitting here talking to you. Just how aware are we of our body whilst we're doing that, of how it's positioned, of how it's moving? The body's always moving, fidgeting, twitching, responding to various feelings, feelings of pain, feelings of discomfort, feelings of pleasure. So maintaining that fundamental basic awareness of the body, awareness of our emotions and our mental activity, awareness of our conditioning, as I've already said, being aware of just what we are under the influence of, the conditioning from our upbringing, from our environment, both not just the physical environment around us, but the cultural environment that we live in, conditioning through our early experiences, conditioning through our associations, the people we mix with, things that we expose ourselves to, the ideas and views that we expose ourselves to. Being aware of our skills and our tendencies, our own abilities and our habitual patterns, and being aware of our likes and dislikes, because they can have a powerful motivational effect on us, which brings us into this awareness of our motivations generally. And if we could go on to the next slide, please. There's a quote here from Bhante, which I'd like to read out to you, because I think it just sums it up so beautifully for me, this awareness that we have of ourselves. And I certainly couldn't put it anywhere near as well as this. So Bhante says, essentially, you are aware of your own uniqueness, aware that universal consciousness has focused itself in you, and that as one of an infinite number of loci of that consciousness, you are irreplaceable. You are intensely, luminously aware. You feel the very vibration of your own individual existence. You are aware of yourself as sharply distinguished, differentiated from the whole of the rest of nature. You are aware of your absolute unrepeatability, of how in the course of ages, through hundreds and millions of years, there will never be anyone else like you. So I don't think I need to say anything to add to that. So moving on from awareness of self, we have awareness of the world. I'm not going to go into any great detail here, but just to say, an awareness of the world around us, of the natural world, from which we all arise, from which we all come. And in terms of the physical body, of course, to which we all return. An awareness of others, an awareness not only of our own uniqueness, but of the uniqueness of all beings and of our relationships with them. And an awareness of reality, of the true nature of reality, cultivating an awareness of how things really are, cultivating an awareness of the constant flow of change in the world around us and in ourselves, that thread of unity that runs through the fabric of all things, that all things are impermanent, all things change. So with this developing self-awareness, there comes a sense that we're no longer submerged in the group. We're no longer held back or restrained by group mentality, by group think, if you like. That we are able to think for ourselves and we are becoming an individual. Becoming an individual, however, shouldn't be confused with being an individualist. The individualist is someone with an overinflated sense of self-importance, and they're determined to inflict that self-importance on everyone around them. I guess we have probably all experienced individualists, if not directly in our lives. Our media is full of them, people who want to stand out because they want to be noticed. They want to be seen as better in some way or another, or as more important or more significant than everyone else. That's the individualist, not an individual. The individualist is still driven by their need to assert their own ego, their own sense of self over and above others. As an individual, we're not going to be psychologically dependent on the group. We don't need the approval of the group. We don't feel a need to conform to ideas or values of the group. We can think for ourselves. We can be ourselves. The individual stands out simply because they are being themselves, not because they're trying to make themselves more important than other people. So as an individual, you accept responsibility for yourself, for your own growth, for your own life, and for the effect that your life has on the life around you. And I'd just like to add a little bit in to round this off, because I'm sure in some of you the questions probably arising, or the thoughts arising, well, here's Silanatha talking about developing the individual and becoming this unique individual. But what about the Buddha's teachings of no self? It wasn't so long ago he was talking to us about how we don't have a self, how there's no self there. How can you reconcile developing the individual if there's no self? Well, I think in order to do that, it's not that difficult. We just need to be clear that we understand this term no self, or the teaching of anatta that the Buddha gave. And when the Buddha taught no self, when he taught anatta, he was concerned with negating the view widely held during his time that at the core of our being there was something fixed and unchanging. Something that we perhaps in the West might recognize more as being similar to the Christian concept of the soul. Now, the Buddha held that there was no such fixed, unchanging core or essence or soul. That he had examined himself and could find no evidence of this, and he challenged his followers, anyone who wanted to follow his path, to do the same. That wherever you look, you will not find a fixed, unchanging core or essence to what we think of as ourselves. What we experience as a self is simply a constantly changing flux of phenomena of experience. And there's no experiencer sitting behind that experience, pulling the strings and levers, as it were. And that's simply what the Buddha meant by it. He wasn't denying that we have this experience of being a personality, of being even a unique personality. He wasn't denying that we experience ourselves in this flow of constantly changing phenomena, just that we shouldn't from that extrapolate this idea that there's some fixed core to ourselves. And indeed, if there were such a fixed, unchanging self, then we wouldn't be able to speak of growth and development. It's only because we are this constantly changing flow of experience that we can transform from the social unit into the true individual.